Thank you very much for being with us right here on the India Development Debate. You with ET Now. I'm Supriya Srinath, and straight on to a top and a big debate this evening. There are really mixed signals on the GST front. The good news is that filings of returns will perhaps get simpler very soon. After the 25th meeting of the GST Council, Finance Minister Arun Jaitley said the panel will soon sit with Aadhaar architect Nandan Nilekani himself for a switch to the single return format. The council also trimmed the duty on a slew of items including used cars, handicraft items and packaged drinking water. The bad news is that the steady fall in revenue collections, especially under the compounding scheme. The finance minister made the government's displeasure in fact quite clear and minced no words, stating that the collections under this head have been just over 300 crore rupees, with most assessees declaring annual incomes and turnover of less than 20 lakh rupees. Surely, as state finance ministers are a worried lot as well. For one, lower GST collections mean a big cut in their share of taxes at a time when their finances are looking rather bleak. Most of the states are also unhappy over the delay in the inclusion of petroleum products and real estate under the GST net. Looks like the problems are only compounding with each passing month. For one, despite the promise of a simplified tax structure, GST has only complicated things for Indian industry, it seems, at least right now. Second, and more importantly, there are no signals of GST boosting GDP growth just yet. Most importantly, the revenue collections are on a steady decline, raising fresh concerns for both the centre and the states. The big GST reboot is a big topic of discussion right here on the India Development Debate this evening, and I've been joined by a very comprehensive, exhaustive and a stellar panel right here on the show. Dr. Indira Rajaraman, former member of the 13th Finance Commission of India, an eminent economist. I've been joined by Najib Shah, former chairman CBEC. Shobhana Kamineni, Preston CII joins us right here. Maithili Basnurmat, consulting editor, ET Now, and V.S. Krishnan, national leader, tax and economic policy group, EY, also joins us. So thank you each one of you for being with us. And Dr. Rajaraman, let me kick off things with you right here in New Delhi. Do you believe the biggest takeaway from today's GST meeting were perhaps two aims that it tried to achieve? One was improving the ease of doing business, and the other was in some sense giving some steroid, trying to fuel employment generation.
Certainly, I think the Finance Minister and the GST Council have taken on board the feedback they've received from the field that the earlier GSTR 1, 2, 3 setup was much too complicated to succeed. And as we all know, until the end of the fiscal year, they had substituted the summary form GSTR 3B, which is still in place. And it's a good thing to know that they are considering collapsing the other three into a single form submission after the end of the fiscal year. That decision will apparently be taken 10 days from now in a video conference meeting. As for employment generation, I don't know that a lot has been done other than perhaps the reduction in the service tax rates, which would certainly boost the demand for services. But I don't know that employment generation has been that much of a focus. I'd say simplification of the filing procedure has been the major focus, although at this meeting they deferred the actual decision to 10 days from now.
No, I will go to simplification in just a bit, and I think they're looking at a more comprehensive simplification given the fact that they have weighed the solutions given by at least three approaches have been dealt with, and Nandan Nilekani's approach seems to find favor at this stage. But before I go across to that, Najib Shah, a shortfall in revenue collection, low compliance that the finance minister seems to himself be very frustrated about, an apparent failure in composition scheme that he mentioned extremely clearly, how all these people who've migrated and most of them reporting turnover of less than 20 lakh rupees and a complicated filing structure which hopefully will get simplified. 6 months after GST implementation, what does this show? Is there an inherent flaw in the way GST has been designed and perhaps implemented?
Well, I would not agree that there's an inherent flaw per se. Yes, there were implementation challenges which were sought to be addressed. The issue raised by the finance minister about the concern and the concerns raised by him regarding the dip in revenue is a matter of, I think, something which the government really needs to step in now. They have thus far been looking on very benignly. And remember also the composition scheme is to be further enhanced in the sense that currently the threshold limit is 1 crore, which is going to be enhanced to 2 crores, and up till 1.5 crores will be the eligible limit for availing the benefit of composition. And if just 300 plus crores has come from these composition scheme registrants, we have a serious problem. I think enforcement will have to start picking up now. I think for far too long now we have been hoping that the right returns and the right revenues due to the governments will be coming, and this has not happened thus far. So yes, it's a matter of concern.
I like the fact that you're being candid when you say this whole benign kid glove approach, hoping and presuming that Indians will turn to GST, will comply, perhaps is not going to work, and there will be some amount of enforcement. Now, will that enforcement mean that there will be a crackdown by the tax department? One doesn't know, and one will have to keep its fingers crossed that doesn't happen. But I'm glad you're being candid, because that's exactly what I made out when I heard the finance minister there. Let me get the CII president on this. And Ms. Shobhana Kamnani, in some sense, and I was tempted to go to simplification of returns, but I think I want to deal with evasion just yet, because I think the broad message is, don't take this lying down. We are not happy with how the GST revenues have been very, very tepid, and how they have consistently fallen in the first 3 months. We're not happy. Don't take this lying down, because we will come cracking down. In some sense, knowing very well that Indians generally are tax evaders, did the government wrongly assume that the transition to one country, one tax system will increase the tax compliance? I mean, were we being presumptuous? Were we being perhaps way too hopeful? And in some sense, has the industry, and by industry I don't mean the big business because they've got their house in order, but the small traders, the small businesses, do you believe they have in some sense invited this ire from the government, invited this suspicion that, all right, you're not going to comply, now we will come calling?
You know, I really thought that this council meeting was about simplification, and they were being benign in terms of direct taxation going up. So what I just heard is a first for me, because I think that I traveled a lot to meet our membership, to see the small SMEs and MSMEs, and I see their pain. So it's just that, you know, business has really gone down for them. So we have to understand that first. And then second is, it's not an easy, those are not easy forms for them to fill, GSTR 1, 2, 3. So, you know, the simplification is important. We need to transition people into those. So on one side, if we're going to have this big threat coming up, I don't think that that's the right message that we should be giving at this time, because, you know, everyone understands that we've increased the filings, that from 400,000 today, I think there are 1 crore plus people that have filed, that, and significant amount of them are under the composition scheme. Yes, it's true that only 300 crores was collected, but I think that's a work in progress, that we should handle it with still a little you know, get the ability for them to understand. There's no demo also. We've been advocating, put demos out there, how to file those returns, have more people, help people through. But that's one, fundamentally, on simplification. The second part of it is that for those small traders, I went to places, you know, smaller towns, and business is still, you know, muted for them. So I think that these are concerns definitely of the smaller MSMEs.
I'm actually very glad that you're putting out the pain of the industry on one hand vis-a-vis what the government is trying to say on the other, and I think there is merit on both sides. But Maithili, come in on that. In some sense, you know, it's easy for us to say that the industry has invited, and by industry again, I'm going to clarify here, we mean the small businesses have invited this ire upon themselves. You know, but you know, for how long can the government keep looking at tepid revenues? Because GST was supposed to be this revenue grosser, GST was supposed to boost the GDP, GST was supposed to be less inflationary, and you know, it hasn't ticked the boxes on all of that on account of low compliance and low revenue collection. But are you equally going to blame the government for how the GST has been implemented. I mean, you know, one part is low compliance. Indians by nature don't like to pay taxes. We are a by and large tax evading country. And the second part, however, is to look at that, you know, the small businesses, the cost of compliance, the number of filings that have to be done. It's very, very complex, and you can't just blame them. You've just about begun to simplify the process.
Yes, but I would agree here, Supriya, with Shobna Kamaneni when she says that GST must be seen as a work in progress, because if you look at how complicated and how revolutionary a transformation it was in the indirect tax space, then it is bound to take some time to stabilize. So government has to take a call. There's always a trade-off between the tweaking that you have to constantly keep doing and stability. At the same time, for small traders, small dealers, small manufacturers, many of whom were never part of the tax net, this is a huge, huge change. So here again, government will have to decide how much carrot, how much stick. So far, I think they were trying to give more carrot than stick, but since the carrot didn't seem to quite work, the government is now kind of healing out these veiled threats that in case you don't, we have means to ensure better compliance. And though the GST per se, we have not seen revenues increase. In fact, we've seen revenues dip month after month. The fact is that direct tax revenues have shot up by 19%, the growth. And one doesn't know how much of this really is a spin-off from the GST. Because remember, one of the big pluses of the GST was the clear audit trail, the way it would bring in more transactions, more people within the tax net. So possibly, just possibly, the increase that we're seeing in the indirect tax, not yet, but we're seeing it in the direct tax front. So I think the government will have to tread a very fine line between incentivizing and at the same time holding out the threat that if you don't comply, we have means to ensure that you do comply in the course of time.
It's a balanced answer, and I think it's a very balanced argument that you must simplify on one hand and then threaten and perhaps put the fear of God on the other. But as somebody who's been a part of the tax department, Mr. Krishnan, as somebody who's been in the chair of a tax man, how do you believe the last mile tax officer is going to read into these comments? Because every time, you know, the government tries to put the tax department or, the tax evasion, the house in order, you see the tax man really cracking down on businesses. And sometimes that can lead to harassment. And that has been a big, big cause of concern. As a former taxman, of course, as an eminent tax expert, do you fear some amount of that may eventually happen? Because, you know, revenue collections are tepid. You need revenue from GST. The finance minister has very categorically said, we have put many ways of anti-evasion. This almost gives license to the taxman to now come calling.
I think, Supriya, the point is that, first of all, there has to be a diagnosis as to why revenue is coming down. So any measure would have to follow this analysis. So, I mean, one is not clear what is the reason for the dip. Is it because of transitional credits? Is it because of export refunds? Because most of the revenue in any case were coming from the large units. So the small units were not contributing significantly to the revenue. So I think first of all, a diagnosis is important. Second, you know, the e-way bill, I think it should have been introduced only for interstate transactions and not for intrastate. Especially when you are looking at invoice matching, I think it should have been, it should commence only for interstate transactions, because you are again putting a tremendous burden on the system. There has been inadequate trials to sort of validate this. So I think, I mean, this again you're putting a load on the system, and again if it fails, again a good measure will get a bad name. So I personally feel that first of all we need a good diagnosis. I think I just did read a headline saying that the CEA has been asked to look at the reasons for the shortfall in revenue. So I think we need a good diagnosis, and the measures employed to curb this should not be excessive.
Measures employed should not be aggressive and should not be excessive, but I think what we need is a good diagnosis. But I think who better than Mr. Najib Shah to tell us what the diagnosis could be? What would you put your finger on, sir? I mean, and you know, you can't blame the finance minister, you can't blame the government. The GST was done with the whole view of being a tax augmenting regime, and here you are seeing taxes dip consistently from October to September to October and then November. What would you put your finger to? And you know, I'm tempted to agree with Mr. Krishnan that, you know, large parts of the tax collection are actually from the big guns. They're not really from the small or medium enterprises.
The first issue really is the problem of transitional credit. There have been news items to suggest that more than 1 lakh crores of such credit has been taken, and the payment continues to be only through the credit, and very little is coming through cash per se. So and obviously the government has to look whether this credit has rightly been taken or wrongly been taken. That's one area where revenue gets directly impacted. Secondly, the concept of GSTR 1, 2 and 3 was to facilitate matching of invoices. This is again as a measure to ensure that evasion does not take place. With one only being filed, and that too by a very, very small number. The last figures were roughly around 50 odd lakhs out of nearly 100 lakhs who have registered. So you have a very big gap in between. Even accounting for the composition scheme dealers who were around 16 lakhs, you still have a number of around 20 odd lakhs, 30 lakhs nearly, who have apparently not been filing returns. We need to know why they have not been filing returns, having registered themselves. The point being made about the small and medium not being major contributors is well taken. Yes, the revenue which comes from them is very limited, but they are major contributors to the entire chain of evasion itself. I don't buy this argument that the SME sector does not know how to file returns. Please remember that the GST threshold limit is 20 lakhs. In the previous VAT regime, it was 5 lakhs for the hilly terrain states and 10 lakhs for all other states. So every one of them was filing returns under the VAT scheme, and they know how to file returns. And they're now largely in the composition scheme, and hence have to file returns only once in a quarter. So there are issues, they are serious issues, because at the end of the day, like you rightly pointed out, GST also was conceived as a revenue enhancing measure by better compliance. Please remember also the rates have been consistently been reduced. That again is going to hurt revenue and impact revenue. Today's reduction again, though largely, I think it's largely optics, but will have some impact on revenue. But the Guwahati council meeting had serious impact on revenue. So I think all these will be the multiple reasons, and each one of these, like Krishnan did point out, has to be diagnosed. I can't agree more with him too. But yes, evasion is a concern. If this drip in revenue is not because of evasion, but because of some other issues, and what can those issues be? It could only be enhanced credit being taken, and invariably I would suspect that credit is incorrectly being taken. So I think the government needs to look at it very closely, and we can't continue to keep having this dip in revenue.
Okay, I'm going to take this question across to Dr. Indira Rajaraman, because she's written extensively about GSTR 1, 2, 3 and how this is all going to solve the problem. After the 25th meeting of the GST Council, the Finance Minister said on record that the panel will soon sit with the Aadhaar architect Nandan Nilekani for a switch to the single return format. And apparently in his presentation also, Mr. Nandan Nilekani spoke about, and one of the proposals under consideration is that the buyer should upload purchase invoice and seller should upload seller invoice, and that will reduce and narrow the gap, and that's perhaps the best way forward, to do it at the level of the buyers and the sellers. Do you essentially buy this argument? Do you believe this is going to resolve a lot of the glitches or the compliance burden that sometimes gets talked about?
Well, certainly if a single return has to be filed, it's an improvement on having to submit 3. But please remember, we don't have that 3 return format in place quite yet. Until the end of this financial year, we still have only GSTR 3B, which is a summary without any provision for cross-checking, and GSTR 1, which is just outward supplies. But the point remains that even if you have a single return instead of 3 returns, which I want to repeat is an improvement, there still will be annexures which will have to be filled with detailed information on invoice-specific transactions. And that is the stumbling block, the great detail which has to be provided, the burden on the GSTR, the GSTN to match invoices. There were a lot of complaints about how a perfectly legitimate tax credit was denied because the network hadn't been able to match invoices and so on. So I don't know that switching to a single return will necessarily solve those problems unless the reduced burden on the GST network does solve the problem of glitches within the network. So yes, some improvement, but the manner in which it's done matters very much. And let's remember that if the composition scheme today is being taken advantage of and as an evasion avenue, let's not forget that the turnover limit for the composition limit kept getting raised from 75 lakhs to 1 crore to 1.5 crore, simply because those small dealers found it so very difficult to deal with or the prospect of dealing with 3 returns a month. So that was one of the reasons why this offer was made to them, that they could move to the composition scheme, which just required quarterly filing. Moving to the composition scheme was, yes, it was an invitation to evasion, but on the other hand, it was a way by which to paper over the problem of the complicated filing process. So what has bedeviled GST right from the start has been very poor design in terms of filing, and then desperate attempts to correct here and there using, Scotch tape just to remedy what was a seriously flawed system to start with. Right. So let's hope that the filing system, once it has been rationalized, then maybe the turnover limit for the composition scheme can be reduced.
All right, let's get in Ms. Shobhana Kamneni, and of course she has a skin in the game, if I may, as a member from Indian industry. And ma'am, would you agree that you can't dispute what Dr. Indra Rajaraman is saying here, that single filing is obviously good, it obviously reduces the burden, but the fact that this decision was not taken in the council today, and now GSTR 1, 2, 3 clubbing, they will sit down and discuss in that committee. The Nanda Nilekani will also be a part of that. It's supposed to all simplify returns, and one of the big criticisms against the GST is that it was supposed to be a good and a simple tax. It's far from that, and all of these things were supposed to make it simple. Are you disappointed that a decision could not be taken today? The fact that the clubbing of GSTR 1, 2, 3 did not happen today, the fact that this suggestion that seemingly find favors that buyers and sellers, the matching at the level of buyers and sellers, are you disappointed this didn't happen today? And do you really believe this is going to resolve a lot of the issues that industry at large has raised?
So, in fact, I'm not disappointed. I would be disappointed if they came out with a flawed decision. So the fact that they couldn't take it and they had to, that they wanted to defer it, to look into it right, because as Maithili said, that, at the beginning they might have done many things that required band-aids. So now when they're rectifying it, if they're rectifying it with great foundation, I think that industry will actually be pleased. That because the problem is evident, there's no one in this panel, actually there's no one in India that refutes the fact that it's not that simple. So anything that moves towards that will improve compliance, and that's sincerely what we feel, that if business is going well, I think that people have realized now that evasion is actually quite difficult. You've seen that even in terms of the direct taxes coming up. And more so, we are going to see more and more of these companies actually come into the tax net and fulfill this. Yes, we'd all like it to be done faster, but then there are many things. I'd like to say that why have we not got, why is petroleum and real estate not on the table? I think that's a big one, especially real estate, where lots of evasion takes place. So these are the things that I think that if we move towards something with actually clear resolve, with proper solutions, industry will actually be happy. And we're looking at that in 10 days, hopefully, via video conferencing.
Yes, hopefully. Keeping our fingers crossed and looking at a solution in 10 days, that's point number one. And I think you're right when you say that let's discuss and debate, but let's not have a flawed solution on the table. I will touch upon petroleum, real estate and electricity being a part of GST a little later in the show, but I just want to get the technical bits out of the way. And Mr. Krishnan, e-way bill for one, many people believe is a big anti-evasion measure. The finance minister spoke about it. Most of the state finance ministers that we interviewed after that believe that it will go a long way in checking evasion. Now, it's going to be implemented for the 1st of February, but the penalties have been deferred by 1 month. There are two ways to look at this. The point number one is that, this is a new thing. You're giving industry some time to get used to it, and so no penalties for 1 month. And the second way to look at it is that you're assuming that there will be a requirement for penalty, that there will be evasion, that there will be loopholes that cannot be plugged to begin with. How are you going to look at the whole e-way bill implementation, and do you believe this is going to go a long way in plugging the loophole?
Supriya, the point is that I think that's why I said at the beginning that the e-way bill is not a new idea. Many of the states have been implementing this. So my own view is, in fact, in my conversation with many of the transporters, the organized transporters have all welcomed the e-way bill, because the e-way bill will replace a lot of the transit passes which are issued by state governments and which are a source of harassment. So actually the e-way bill will ensure that particular bill will ensure smooth movement across if it is verified through some electronic arrangements like the RFID. So the transit pass system will go, and that will be a huge relief. So the e-way bill will replace an existing system, and that's why I said that it should be implemented only for interstate transactions and not for intrastate transactions. This will reduce the complexity. And it's a good idea. It's a system. It's a less intrusive way of ensuring the principle, trust but verify.
Yeah, I agree, but there are states like Bihar and others who are insisting upon an intra-state, and I wonder what and how it's going to play out. So I'll let Mr. Najib Shah touch upon that, but I also will shift the focus on the other big aim that seemed to be coming out of this meeting, and that is employment. I mean, one part of it was ease of doing business, but the other is employment. A slew of other items being reduced from 28 to 18 and 18 to 12, Mr. Shah. Do you really realistically believe this is going to boost employment? I mean, the fact that handicraft is now in that 0% rate, obviously, lack of jobs and joblessness is a big cause of concern. And this is perhaps being done with a view to fuel job generation. But do you believe this is going to resolve the issue? Is this a single decisive factor in job creation? Or is this one of the many factors, and unless you don't get that house in order, this perhaps is not going to account for too much?
I think the steps taken in the handicraft sector are welcome. Handicrafts provide a lot of employment. They don't really give too much of revenue, and their reach is far in the rural areas. So I think the steps are welcome. There's a lot of issues regarding the definition of handicrafts itself. It always is a challenge. Largely made by hand, which is pleasing to the eye. These are the sort of things which are typically in a definition of handicraft. That poses a challenge for the tax administrators to come to a conclusion whether a particular commodity is handicraft or not. Furniture is a very typical example. It passes off as handicraft because it's largely made by hand. You also have machine-made furnitures, and how are you going to distinguish between the two? So these are issues, but I think that is a largely welcome step taken today in reducing the tax rates on handicraft.
Fair point indeed. I mean, I agree with your point that, A, definition, and B, of course, a sector like handicraft where there are small units and where tax is perhaps a factor. But Ms. Kamineni, before I go across to the agro products, will the announced exemptions, especially in sectors like textile, protect the informal sector? Will this really go on to increasing jobs? Because, whether it is GST implementation and the disruption on account of that, or whether it was demonetization, there has been a significant job erosion, at least in the informal space. And do you realistically believe this can bring back and recreate some of those jobs?
You know, I think that most of the jobs were lost in construction and real estate, so we need to get those back, but you're going to deal with it later. I was in Surat last week, and they did tell me that they have almost 1 lakh in that one market, 100,000 branded manufacturers, and for them they needed consumption to come back. You know, that it's still at 50%. But I do think that what they've done in terms of handicrafts, what they've done for the smaller industries will help, will actually go a long way in you know, the rationalization of taxes will go a long way in bringing some jobs back into the market, and especially in these smaller places and industries that require textiles, leather, all these that require a lot of people to be working there. So it's important. I'm glad that they looked at that.
Yeah, I wanted to come in on the job generation in the informal space on account of handicrafts, but also want to ask you, agro products, for instance, you know, on certain chemical fertilizers and things, that rate has been reduced. Does it really make a difference to the stressed Indian farms? I mean, I know a lot has been written, said, spoken, debated about how acute the rural stress is, and is the government in oblivion? But considering this is a step taken to reduce the stress, do you believe it will be a significant one? Will it make a big difference? Or is this largely semantics?
Well, in principle, it's always a wrong idea, not a very good idea at all, to use tax policy to achieve objectives like increasing employment, increasing investment, reducing the distress in the farm sector. So I think it really doesn't help at the it might make a marginal difference, but only at the margin. So I think this is a wrong way of going about it. The best way of removing rural distress is to have better growth and to have policies, government policies, focused on the rural sector. So higher growth is the best way of ensuring better employment. And if you have higher growth and government policies which to remove all the distortions in agriculture, both on the input side as well as the output side, I think you will see the stress in agriculture coming down. Tax policy is not the way to remove rural distress. I think the government also knows it, but because reform in agriculture is so much more difficult to actually do, the government is taking these small, you know, band-aid solutions, as it were, and that's not really the answer, either for increasing investment or employment or saving rural distress.
You called it Band-Aid, Dr. Rajaraman called it here Scotch tape, but I will go on to lower revenue tax collections and just talk about the big picture for a minute as far as the fisc is concerned. And Dr. Rajaraman, let me bring with you. Obviously, the government is worried about its revenue collection from GST coming down from 95,000 crore in July to around 80,000 crore in December. They have reasons to worry. You've had finance ministers, state finance ministers come out of that meeting and talk about lower revenue collections. They've spoken about anti-evasion measures and all of that. Is this the first strife that we are seeing after a very amiable sort of a GST implementation between the center and the state on revenues? Because obviously they are talking about, will compensation be enough? Will the central government be left with enough finances because they are, you know, they're obliged to compensate the states for any revenue erosion?
Well, you know, right from the start, as you know, the 14% increase every year for states was a way by which states were taken on board on all decisions. And I've always thought it was a perverse incentive, because it meant that state governments were not looking at the impact of GST on medium and small industry and on growth and so on. That said, I don't think, I mean, even though state governments now are protesting about the fall in revenues, ultimately they are protected by the compensation. And as long as the compensation mechanism works, they really don't have any worries. The big worry is really for the center. But if I can just go back to the earlier question you asked about agriculture. Actually, I think these were the best decisions taken at this meeting. Just look at the items on which the GST rate has been brought down from 18% to 12%. Fertilizer, and drip irrigation systems in a country where we do need drip irrigation, mechanical sprayers and biopesticides. Very importantly, the rate reduction was not on chemical pesticides, it was on biopesticides. This is a very, very heartening incentive given for the use of biopesticides. So yes, I would say that this reduction, I mean 18% on agricultural inputs was crazy. And even though yes, tax reform or tax rate change is not the best way by which to reform a sector, At the same time, these were all shoot yourself in the foot rates to have 18% on agricultural inputs. So the fact that that has been removed has removed an earlier bad element in the structure of taxation, and to that extent I think it is a reform and a very welcome one, although obviously it's not going to solve all problems in agriculture, but this has been a very, very good thing.
It's always good to have disagreements on the show, and I'm glad Jaitley and you are disagreeing on the approach to kind of lending that helping hand to agriculture. Always good to have an intellectual disagreement there. But Mr. Shah, if I may come to you, and just on the larger fiscal picture, around 35,000 crore IGST has been lying with the government, will be provisionally divided between the centre and the states. For states, the average revenue shortfall is around 20.7% as of December. In case the shortfall of the centre has to compensate the states, which amounts to over 39,000 crore rupees. Please pardon me for all the numbers I'm throwing at everybody on this show, but this is data I'm quoting. Will this be enough to augment the shortfall? And you know, the finance minister spoke very hopefully about the collection from direct taxes, which is up nearly 19%. Where is the government going to mop up this extra revenue from? I mean, they've just cut their borrowing target by a good number there. They're now talking about more divestment proceeds perhaps will come in, but will that all be enough to help plug this shortfall from GST?
I really hope so, because like Professor Indra Rajaraman pointed out, the states are sitting pretty. They are assured of compensation, and it is entirely the centre which has to bear the brunt of this shortfall. It is going to be very, very, very challenging, and hopefully direct tax will step in and make good this shortfall, which is likely to happen on the indirect tax side. Customs revenue really can't compensate for all this difference. Revenue from petroleum from central excise will continue, so till such time it comes into GST. So that again is a good number. That should give some revenue to the government, but ultimately it is GST, which is CGST revenue, which has to come in to play. I don't know how this the shortfall will be met unless direct tax really steps in.
Fair point indeed. Let's move to a topic that we've all been wondering, and why has that not happened? And I'll throw this across to both Mr. V.S. Krishnan and Shobhana Kamineni, but let me begin with Mr. Krishnan. You know, it was said very categorically today after that briefing that, you know, whether it's electricity or whether it's petroleum or real estate, this will be taken up in the next meeting, which is perhaps likely to happen by the end of March. Are we looking at an inclusion by the end of the March of these three things that should have been there to begin with, realistically speaking?
I think this is the next big agenda on the GST Council's. I mean, I think first of all, I think it's a no-brainer that electricity should be part of the GST, because you know it's already carrying heavy. I mean, it's carrying heavy input costs which are not being offset, and bringing electricity into the GST will hugely help Indian manufacturing. That's one. Second, I think in India the reforms have concentrated on the product markets and not enough on the factor markets like labor and land. And I think bringing real estate into the GST would do more to eliminate black money generation than demonetization ever did. So I think real estate, electricity should be in, and petroleum, the worry is really on the revenue side. And I think a beginning can be made by bringing in natural gas in, because natural gas, the revenues are not very significant, and natural gas is an industrial intermediate. So I think we can bring in real estate, electricity and natural gas from the 1st of April next year.
That's an interesting argument that you're making. As far as electricity is concerned, the input cost and it will help Indian manufacturing, and real estate, of course, will help curb the black money generation. But Shobhana Kamineni, I know you referred to this earlier, and we're all eagerly waiting for this to happen. It took us a while to get the political consensus on things other than real estate, petroleum and electricity. Of course, alcohol is a non-story to begin with, but do you realistically see that the government will be able to derive a consensus, especially going into, especially going into an election year? 2019 is going to be an election year. Will they be able to derive a consensus on inclusion of these? Will states find favor with this? And like someone said here, states are sitting pretty on their revenue, so it's not as if there's something to worry about. I think Mr. Shah said this. They don't have much to worry about because they will be compensated, at least for the first few years, on any revenue loss. On that count, do you believe there can be a political consensus on inclusion of the items that I just mentioned?
See, Supriya, I'm not here to really comment on whether the politics of this can make it happen. But I think that the importance is the economics of it is necessary. So especially if you look at electricity, there's some states that have almost 30 different pricing points to 100 different pricing points. So there's just, the complexity of that, make it transparent, simple, make it across the country that you have some kind of uniformity will really help industry. It'll help that ease of doing business that is all important to this government. And when you come to real estate, we were linking jobs with a lot of these taxes, and I think that is the one that when we remove this, when you create more transparency and you remove tax evasion and really get, there's so many people here in this country. If you need an election mission, is really to have more housing for everybody, and this will come only if our construction sector, if our real estate sector gets simplified and becomes more transparent. So I think there's actually an economic or a business case for making all this happen. And of course petroleum, I think that there's an overlying worry about where the world petroleum prices are going. So I like what Krishnan said, is that do it in an easy area first, which is much smaller, of natural gas, and move up.
Yeah, that's a pragmatic approach perhaps, but I want to get Mr. Najib Shah here because, he was part of how difficult this consensus making was. I don't want you to relive that horror all over again, but I do want to ask you, given the fact that, oil prices have been such a bone of contention. I think the last time around when oil prices went up from $50 to $65 a barrel and there was no, there was no price revision by oil marketing companies, everybody was up in arms, and the only solution that seemed to be on the anvil was that let's get petroleum under the GST and then all our issues will be sorted out. So on that count and on the other count that Ms. Kaunani made about, real estate being under the GST, curbing on black money and helping job generation, on both those counts, how difficult or easy will it be to arrive at a political consensus on this one? Because we only seem to reform when we push to a corner. And as far as petroleum prices are concerned, we were looking at levels of 40, 45, we are now staring at levels of 70.
As regards real estate, there has been a dramatic shift, I think, in the political sentiments. I would not like to comment too much about it, except the fact that a lot more is being said by a lot more finance ministers, and that is a welcome move, because earlier when this issue was brought on the agenda, it really did not take off because there were a house of protest all around, which is why it kept getting shelved. So I'm happy that it is being now discussed a little more seriously, and I think it's a step which needs to be taken urgently. As regards petroleum products, getting it into the GST again is so very important in cutting down costs, because credits will be available. This is a cost which is sticking on to all products across. But remember, if we bring petroleum products into the GST, the states are getting a lot of revenue from petroleum products, from the sale of petroleum products within their states. So the burden of compensation will increase to that extent for the center. And unless and until overall compliance improves, whereby revenues get increased and the compensation reduces, it's going to be challenging. But yes, it is necessary to bring it in sooner rather than later.
Oh, absolutely. It's necessary to bring it sooner. I've got 6 last minutes left on the show, and I'm going to take a quick last question around the table on this. And Dr. Rajaman, let me begin with you. Rate cuts, rollbacks, implementation glitches, low revenue fall. This is how the GST is evolving. How do you look into this? Do you look at it as, big reforms like this? This is how it happens. It's a path-breaking reform. It has changed how taxation happens in this country. It has to be a piecemeal approach. It will evolve as it's implemented. Or do you believe there has to be a tacit admission by the government that we rushed into it?
Certainly, you know, the entire design of the GST was seriously flawed, not just in terms of filing complications, but even in terms of the rate structure. If you look at the manner in which the rates were prescribed, this really goes back to the pre-reform structure in which rates were different for walnuts and for cashew nuts and so on. We thought we had moved away from that. It was not just the multiple rate structure, but the assignment of products to rate structure, to the rate structure that was so seriously flawed. And that did not have to be that way in a rushed situation. As a matter of fact, none of these problems happened because we rushed into the GST. Happened because there was just not enough thought going into it. I don't think the Fitment Committee really fit the rates very well at all. I don't think the filing frequency was thought through. But I just want to add very quickly about the three products that you mentioned earlier: electricity and petroleum and real estate. Given the way the constitutional amendment is framed, and I would particularly like to throw this question to Mr. Shah on the panel, does not that amendment have to be further amended if electricity is brought in? Because that entry in the state list has not been mentioned in the constitutional amendment as something that will be replaced. So the constitutional amendment itself will have to be amended again. As far as petroleum is concerned, the constitutional amendment does mention very explicitly that the GST Council is free to bring in petroleum at any point. So that doesn't pose a problem. But I think, again, real estate poses a problem. So if we are going to bring those in, it's not going to be a simple matter. It has to go back to Parliament.
I get Mr. Shah to respond to that, and going back to Parliament will mean that we will perhaps look at the budget session. Actually, it may not happen by then. A lot later than that, before this gets the assent of Parliament. Both real estate and electricity, there will have to be legislative changes that will require to be made, Mr. Shah.
No, real estate will not pose a problem. Because it will be construed as any other supply. It will not constitute a constitutional challenge. Petroleum products, like the professor mentioned, is already part of the constitutional amendment. Yes, on electricity, we would have a problem. It will not be so easy to bring it in into the GST scheme.
Fair point. I'll just go back to my last round of questions. Ms. Kamini, you know, please come in on the point that Dr. Rajaraman made, that it wasn't just about rushed implementation. It was not very well thought through. But, you know, we've taken it off. Changes have been made. Rates have been rationalized. Hopefully, the return will be simplified in another 10 days. How hopeful are you? And by when are you hopeful that we will have a near perfect GST to deal with?
You know, we were part of the process. We worked on this for 10 years, which would be the right muhurtam to make that, you know, the perfect. And so I won't say that it's deeply flawed, but I can say that that, you know, changes were required, and I'll tell you, a lot of businesses were, you know, our attention, instead of being on the market, were actually figuring out this entire process. But now I think that, you know, we've seen that the government is listening. So many of those rates are being cut. They're being simplified. Maybe it was difficult for them to do what we suggested, that only 3 taxes would have worked. I mean, 3 slabs would have worked. But now, if we see that what's happened in the last year, or actually 9 months since we started GST, they've been listening. And I do believe that, that we will come to a point where most of these pieces will fall in place, and a lot of the big issues will get corrected. Many of them have already been done. We're looking at steps that I see very shortly, another 1-2 quarters. But beyond that, if things are not set, then I think that industry will be less tolerant. Right now, we want to work the process through, and we're hopeful that, that you know, taxes will actually become simplified, transparent. There'll be more people to share the burden of taxes, and this is the way the country will evolve.
So industry will be less tolerant, because just this evening we heard the finance minister say the government will be less tolerant. But I get your anguish and I get where you're coming from. Mr. Krishnan, GST was supposed to be less inflationary. It was supposed to boost GDP growth. It was supposed to help augment tax collections. A lot of that has really not happened. By when do you believe all of this will begin to happen? By when at least will one of these begin to happen? When will we see the tax base grow up? Is it all on account of simplified returns? Is it on account of rate rationalization? And now that at least both things are being dealt with, when will we see that evolve?
Supriya, we are too near the event to pass a judgment. And one is reminded of Deng Xiaoping's statement when asked about the impact of the French Revolution. He said it's too early to say. I think we are too near the event to really evaluate this, but it's certainly a transformational tax reform. And my own feeling is that in another 6 months' time, things will settle down. And what will be the biggest gain is the behavioral change as far as tax compliance is concerned. These things take time to happen. And I think in the next 2 to 3 years, our tax to GDP ratio will go up from now between 16 to 17 to around about 20%, which is the norm for countries like India, emerging market countries. And certainly it's a transformational tax reform. Some of the imperfections in the system were due to, I think, the desire to bring the states on board. There were compromises. There was this trust deficit between the center and the state which had to be bridged, and I think the center went the extra mile to bring the states into the GST, which is why some compromises were made, which are now being settled. And I think we have in the GST Council a great institutional innovation uniquely Indian, which I think will sort out problems. It has shown great maturity in the days it has, from the time it's been set up, and I am very confident that things will settle down and we'll witness really a behavioral change as far as tax compliance is concerned.
Fair point indeed. I really have the last 1 minute on the show. I will request both of you to be very, very brief. Mr. Shah, have we seen that mindset change happen in India on account of the GST implementation?
Not so far, unfortunately. But hopefully, I'll share the optimism of Krishnan, and hopefully we will see those changes soon rather than later.
And Maithili, to you then, did the government place too much faith in business, and was business not to, it talked about GST very eagerly, but when it was implemented, it didn't seem to embrace and espouse it. Which side would you blame more for?
Well, it's very difficult to kind of cast aspersions on either side. I would like to agree with Mr. Krishnan, and I hope his confidence is well deserved. And I'd like to be a little bit more charitable as compared to Indira, but I think it did involve a great deal of compromises. Remember how many finance ministers of how many states and union territories had to agree. So I would repeat that this is an experiment. It's a work in process, and I do hope it will succeed. And I share some, if not all, of Mr. Krishnan's optimism.
All right, on that very, very optimistic note, I think we've completely run out of time on this edition of the India Development Debate. GST, no doubt, is a transformational reform. It is work in progress. It has to get better for industry to embrace it and for the government to begin reaping some rich dividends out of this. Tax compliance has always been a very tricky issue in India, but we do hope this will lead to mindset changes. The KidGov approach, like the government says, will have to go, but it has to be a simpler tax for the industry to embrace. Thank you very much for being with us on this edition of the India Development Debate. I can't thank my stellar panel enough for joining us this evening as well.